The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Chairman, I want to support the amendment in the name of Labor's Deputy Leader Grant Robertson that this legislation should not come into effect until after there has been a full and independent public inquiry. And the reasons for that, Mr Chairman, I think are obvious even to the government members that are supporting this legislation. First, what we have had is poor process and rushed process that give the New Zealand public no confidence that the case has been made out for the significant expansion of power of the GCSB, and a public that has no confidence that the oversight mechanisms proposed in this legislation are anywhere near adequate to protect the privacy of New Zealanders living in a democracy and to stop the unwarranted intrusion into the privacy of individuals by an agency that works in secret and is being given more extensive powers. You know, there's another reason why there needs to be a full and a full independent public inquiry into this legislation. The tradition in this House has always been, because of the importance of democracy and because of the fundamental powers that can be exercised in secret by the security agencies, that consensus is sought. Consensus has never been sought by the national government. It is a fact that John Key said to David Shearer that he wasn't interested in Labor's support because he could get it from Peter Dunn. You know, this legislation, Mr Chairman, will go through on the vote of one discredited and disgraced member who was sacked. I'll come to the second one in a moment. One disgraced and discredited member who was sacked because he leaked the report on the GCSB. It is going through on the vote of one discredited member who said, under no circumstances, quote unquote, will I support giving the GCSB the power to spy on New Zealanders. That's what the strength of support for this legislation is, Mr Chairman. A man who broke his word, who broke his promise that he wouldn't support it, a man that leaked the report and was sacked by the Prime Minister for doing it. And we want to talk about the second member that Mr Mallard mentioned. It's the man that was intimately involved with Kim.com, but couldn't remember the helicopter ride, couldn't remember the excised person that he went to visit in the biggest house in the country, and most of all couldn't remember the $50,000 that he asked for in the form of 2 cheques of $25,000 each. Now I say to you, Mr Chairman, what this legislation needs is the basis of consensus of support across the House, and the national government hasn't even made the effort to do that. Hasn't even made the effort to do that, and there will be no confidence in the New Zealand public in a piece of legislation that is rammed through this House on the vote of 2 people that the public has no confidence in, and who are disgraced and discredited members. I want to say another thing why we need the full and independent inquiry, Mr Chairman. We need it because not only does there need to be a consensus of support across this House for such legislation and the extensive powers it confers, there needs to be a basis of trust and confidence by the New Zealand public. And the New Zealand public has no trust and confidence in our security agencies. That was proved in a poll that was done by TV3 that showed that 40% of New Zealanders did not trust the GCSB. And a more recent but perhaps less scientific poll that showed that 89% of New Zealanders, 50,000 of them who gave their name and address and their email, who said that they were against this legislation. 89%. We do not have the basis in this House or in this country for this legislation to pass. And it's a disgrace that the government is ramming it through against the wishes of New Zealanders and without proper process. You know, they would not even let the GCSB give evidence and be questioned by the Select Committee. What sort of legislation is it that we are passing where the agency that we're giving extensive power to was not allowed by the Prime Minister to appear before the Select Committee? How do we we know how efficient and effective that Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman,
Phil Goff.
how do we know how effective and efficient that agency is when it was not allowed by the Prime Minister to be subject to scrutiny? How do we know whether those powers are justified or not? You know, the Prime Minister in his panic talked about the Boston bombings and Al-Qaeda. The Prime Minister knows, as I know and every member of this House knows, that those terrorist agencies and individuals can right now be placed under the scrutiny both of the SIS and the GCSB. Those sort of scare tactics do no credit to the Prime Minister. The legislation is in place. What we don't have is legislation that gives the GCSB, that shares its intelligence with overseas agencies, also to have the power to spy on New Zealanders. You know, you've got to think about the origins of this legislation. We are discussing this legislation because the GCSB acted illegally in the first place. They subjected Kim.com to scrutiny that they had no legal authority to do. And then when the Kitteridge report was produced, it showed that they'd put another 85 New Zealanders under surveillance that they had no legal authority to do. You would think this legislation would have responded to those two incidents by strengthening the safeguards that New Zealanders have against abuse of power. You would think that that would happen particularly when the NSA in the United States has been found to have subjected illegally tens of thousands of Americans to surveillance, when the GCHQ in the United Kingdom has been found to have been spying on its friends, not its enemies. You would think there would have been caution. You would think that the government would have reached out to the opposition and said, yes, we need security agencies, and the opposition agrees with that, but we need them subject to proper protections of the rights and privacies of New Zealanders. That is not in this legislation. This legislation is patently inadequate. That is not simply the view of this Labour opposition, that is the view of the New Zealand Law Society. But what does the arrogance of the Prime Minister tell us? The Law Society doesn't understand what's in the law. Some of the top QCs in this country that have condemned this legislation, and John Key minus QC or any other law qualification, says they don't know what they're talking about. And then the Human Rights Commission, which was established by the government to protect the rights of New Zealanders, says this legislation won't do. It gives intrusive powers. It does not provide safeguards against abuse. What does our Prime Minister do? He threatens the funding of the agency for having the temerity to do the job that under statute they do in this country. And then there's the Privacy Commissioner. The Privacy Commissioner, a woman who has been Secretary of Cabinet for over a decade, says this legislation is not ready, it's not adequate, it needs to go back to the drawing board. The government ignores that comment from a woman who understands very well what this legislation could, should, but does not provide. So, Mr. Chairman, it is abundantly clear to the country and to this House that this legislation isn't appropriate, will not survive in this form, does not do the job expected of it, and does not protect the essential rights of ordinary New Zealanders to be protected against abuse of powers by agencies that act in secrecy and have no scrutiny over them. And then we have the other problem, Mr. Chairman. I don't know how you deal with this problem in legislation. The Prime Minister has enormous power of oversight and control, but he misuses that power. Right. He appoints the Director General of the GCSB by an appointment process condemned by the State Services Commissioner. He says, when it's finally extracted from him, oh yes, I do know this person, but not very well. He's known him since they were both children at school. They had dinner together, which he did not ever admit. And then the Prime Minister wants us to believe that we should pass a piece of legislation that will say something, not because it's written into legislation, but because he gives a speech in the third reading debate and says, this is what I intend. We don't need legislation, Mr. Chairman, which is what the Prime Minister claims he intends. We need clear, specific, good legislation that says what this House means and this legislation does not do what the Prime Minister says that it does. There is every reason why this legislation should be reconsidered.
Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.